Shalom and welcome to this month's edition of the European Report. Here we are in the European Parliament in the heart of the European Union. And in today's programme, well, we have to discuss all the key developments that are taking place in the Middle East right now, in Gaza, in Jerusalem, with Turkey and also with the Iran deal. So to discuss these huge issues facing the Middle East today, I'm joined by Tomas Sandell, founder and director of the European Coalition for Israel, and Branislav Škripek, MEP for the European Conservatives and Reformists Group. Welcome back to the programme.
Thank you.
And Paulo Casaca, Executive Director of South Asia Democratic Forum and a former Portuguese MEP. So welcome to the programme. Tomas, it's very rare that we do a programme where we see so much happening in the Middle East right now, with President Trump opening the US Embassy in Jerusalem, to the violence that we're seeing. There's a Hamas-inspired protests on Israel's border with Gaza, the situation of Turkey expelling Israel's diplomat, Nitan Ate, and together with the Iran deal and the military provocation between Israel and Iran in Syria. What do you make of everything that's going on right now?
Well, Simon, first of all, it's good to be on the program. It's good to be in Brussels, actually. I just came home from Israel and I was scheduled to be in Jerusalem this week. But I figured strategically it's in places like Brussels where Israel really need its friends on a week such as this week. So therefore, I'm particularly happy to be in Brussels and to defend the Jewish state. As you mentioned, I think it's unique for any nation in the world right now to have so many different threats facing the nation. And I think if there's anything that the Israelis are amazing at is multitasking. You know, on the one hand, simultaneously you are celebrating the 70th anniversary, you are celebrating the opening of the US Embassy, while at the same time having to keep an eye on the northern border with the potential of missile strikes in from Syria, and obviously what is happening in Gaza, the intrusion and the so-called peaceful demonstration with Hamas terrorists using human shields as to bring up the number of casualties. So, as you rightly said, there's so many things going on simultaneously. I think it's important in a program like this to put the record straight, to just mention some very basic facts that are being ignored in the media right now. So I'm looking forward to a lively discussion.
Absolutely. And Branislav, it's a pleasure to have you back on the European Report, and we want to thank you for the role that you play here in the European Parliament in standing up for Christians and also standing up for Israel. Now, in recent weeks, we've seen that President Trump has abandoned the Iran deal. We've seen Iranian military provocation of firing 20 rockets into Israel from Syria. What are your thoughts on what is happening, and how should the EU respond to this Iranian provocation?
Yeah, we have clearly seen that European leaders have expressed their willingness to support and fulfill the treaty even without the USA. What I'm missing in EU response or attitude is more emphasis on the situation of Middle East people, of the situation of the citizens of the Middle East, because they are oppressed and they suffer in Iran, under Iranian regime, but also in Iraq and Syria. We know about Iranian military presence in Syria, and kind of silence is over this fact. So I'm in touch with the Iranian opposition, and they refer clearly about huge demonstration of citizens of Iran against the regime. So Iran is expanding its military presence in the whole region and building military bases even close to Israeli borders. I think this is a danger, and this adds to an instability of the situation. And we all have seen also the news about the existence of documents which simply speaks proving Iranian nuclear weapon research, and it was almost no remarked by others. I mean, anybody said nothing. There was a silence about it. So member states should thoroughly reconsider this deal if they want to stop military expansion in the region. So I condemn these Iranian attacks on Israel. Israel had the right to protect itself by adequate means. So I expect that Iranian allies will appeal to Iran to stop their presence and rhetoric and step towards eradicating the Jewish state. I think this is still unacceptable. It's 2018 today, and there is still a statement to eradicate the Jewish state. How does it come? So open war would be a total disaster to the Middle East and also for us. So preventing that Iran becomes a nuclear power is a good and right policy.
Excellent. I like your moral clarity, so thank you, Branislav. And Paulo, it's great to have one of the world's leading experts on Iran on the programme. Good to have you back on the programme. Can you share your insight into what's happening within the regime now that President Trump has decided to pull out of the Iran deal? We know that as of the recording of this programme that the Iranian foreign minister was here in Brussels with meetings with Mogherini. What's happening inside the Iranian regime right now?
Good morning, Simon, and it's really a pleasure being with you and Tomas and Branislav in the program. I think that the major symbol of the real crisis of the regime was the ability of the Israeli intelligence to come with piles of documents, massive, nearly tons of files that were taken out of Tehran without the knowledge of the Iranian regime leaders. This has shown that even within the closest ranks to the top of the regime, trust is not there.
Yep.
And actually, from COM, you have clerics that are now saying that the principle of the jurisprudence has to be taken out of the Iranian constitution. You have in the bazaar that we should remember was at the start the core support of the regime. You have strikes in the bazaar in Tehran, at the border. You have the porters that have been shot at by the regime. You have massive strikes by workers protesting against unpaid salaries. You have the youth, you have the women. The women are really the most spectacular of all of them because they are courageous, the most courageous, defying the regime by getting out the shadow. So in the last 5 months, it has really been an incredible story of a rebellion from the Iranian people. And I think at the bottom of this rebellion is the knowledge of the people that the regime used all of the funds that the Obama administration sent to it not to answer the plight of the people, but to continue and to reinforce its foreign operations with terror and invasions in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq. And this is what people are really not happy with.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Tomas, we had the Iranian foreign minister here in Brussels yesterday with high-level meetings with other heads, foreign ministers from member states, trying to keep the Iran deal back on track. We know that particularly President Trump's embassy move from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem is certainly stoking up tension in the region. But when we consider Israeli intelligence and to consider that Israel carried out one of the most audacious raids in the history of espionage in taking up 55,000 pages of documents, 183 CD-ROMs on Iran's nuclear weapons program. Why aren't European member states and why isn't the European Commission taking seriously the evidence presented by Israel that Iran was didn't comply with the Iran deal in terms of developing nuclear weapons?
Well, Simon, I think there's a very simple psychology in all of this. You don't want to lose face. I mean, there was so much political prestige invested into this nuclear deal. To come back a few years later and say that it was all, for nothing, and we've been fooled, of course, would be a disaster for the trust in the European institutions. So I think it would take a lot for Federica Mogherini or the others who were involved in the deal making to admit it just won't happen. But what I still would come back to, and which wasn't covered by the nuclear deal, and we would always bring it up in this program, is to say that they would always separate and say, well, the nuclear containment is one thing. What Iran does in the region is something completely different that we have to deal with in a different way. It never happened. And I think what we see today as a result is that the region is much more unstable, and as Paulo rightly pointed out, Iran as a society is in turmoil. So something failed catastrophically. And it's also interesting to see in retrospect that all the European leaders who were involved somehow in the deal making, today they admit, they say it was not a good deal. And they even say that we know that we could not trust the Iranians, and that's why we needed a deal. So there's something which is very irrational in all the defense of the nuclear deal. And obviously, I, for one, welcome the pullout of the Americans. And now I just hope that there would be a constructive dialogue across the Atlantic to say, well, where do we go from here? And then to find a common tune to contain Iran, but also to address the role of Iran also in Gaza and in the intrusion now from Hamas. So everything is connected.
Absolutely. And Branislav, the European Commission, the EU member states have invested billions in Iran since the signing of the Iran deal in 2015. But when we look, the issue of Iran's intercontinental ballistic missiles was never put on that treaty. And to think that Iran has the missile capabilities of not only hitting Israel and other member states, but also Europe as well, has Europe put finance and money and power above security in this situation?
Yeah, it's very clear that the Commission and the MEPs understand that nuclear-armed Iran is a threat to Europe, but now we became a hostage of our investment. Now, we probably thought that since 2015, since the signing of the document, we would get some safety. But what's happened now, however, current deal is a threat to Europe. And we didn't realize it probably. You mentioned billions of Europe invested in Iran. Yes, a large part of that money went ultimately to military Iranian expansion in Syria. Nobody, and Iraq, and nobody was mentioning that again. So it's clearly fueled the refugee stream from Syria to Europe again. So Iranian militias and military have carried out a large part of that campaign of the Syrian regime against the Syrian people. So these people then fled to Europe, and we have a problem again. So what's happened? Iran deal needs an update that limits the conventional military expansion of Iran, and that was a missing part.
Excellent, thank you. And Paulo, could you give us some insight into other trends that are taking place in the Middle East right now? That three historic enemies back in April got together. I know this has been a process going on for years. You mentioned prior to the program that the Turks, the Iranians, and the Russians are joining forces. Could we see a new military alliance being formed with Turkey, Iran and Russia against Israel, against Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, and also the United States within the Middle East?
Well, this alliance is a fact, and it has been operating for already quite some time. I think that the Prince of Mohammed of Saudi Arabia was one of the first of publicly speaking of this triad, this very dangerous evil triad. It is, of course, even to me, was a surprise when I saw these two centers, the Turkish and the Iranian, to get together, since we know very well that they have ultimately a geopolitical competition that has been going for centuries, and it still remains. But I think it is this sort of alliance of the sort of the Soviet-German pact that surprised everyone, and of course did not last. And I think this one will not last either, but it is very difficult to say when will it break.
Excellent. And Thomas, we have to discuss, obviously, other developments are taking place in the Middle East, and particularly those between Israel and Turkey, for example. And President Erdogan has called upon Israel to withdraw Israel's ambassador to Turkey, Itan Nahe. We're also seeing as well that Erdogan has also called upon Islamic states to meet together to come up with a common strategy to confront and deal with Israel, even cut off ties with the Jewish state. How dangerous are these developments, not only for Israel, but also for the direction that Turkey is taking the Middle East in terms of European interests?
Well, I think the situation as it is already as dangerous as anything can be. I'm not sure we can even add anything to this equation that would make it more dangerous. We have to remember the role of Erdogan and Turkey. It's mostly just a play for the mirrors and media, and of course also not to lose face and try to give the impression that they are ahead of the game. But we also know how disunited the Arab world is at the moment. So I don't see Erdogan being a person that would be able to mobilize the forces. And of course, looking then from a European perspective, the Europeans will then have to find their own position behind the Americans on the one hand and the Arab world on the other hand. So obviously I'm very concerned about Erdogan and Turkey and the developments there in the last few years. But as far as a concrete threat to Israel, in addition to what we already see, I would perhaps downplay that component.
Yeah. Branislav, we've been talking very much about the Iranian regime, and in your first opening statement on this program, you talked about the plight of persecution of Christians and other minorities. Why do you believe there is such a wall of silence when it comes to the plight of Christians in Iran and also in the Middle East, and how we got to play a role in protecting fellow Christians who are being persecuted just because they believe in Jesus?
It's such a difficult question, or difficult to accept this. I would say that the EU simply has lost its ability to recognize its true allies. Christians in the Middle East represent not only strategic partners to a union, but also people group with close cultural and spiritual ties. The temptation to trade with such a huge country like Iran is a huge, of course. EU trade export. Let's have a look on how much there is a EU and member states with Iran of trade. So it was over 10.8 billion euro, with total trade almost 20 billion. So most EU imports from Iran are energy related, which is 75% of oil and other fuels. So there are interests of European companies in it. Total, French company, signed a deal worth $5 billion to help Iran develop the world's largest gas field. Norway, Saga Energy, signed $3 billion deal to build solar power plants. Airbus clinched a deal to sell 100 jets to Iran Air, which is very clear. European turboprop maker ATR, which is an Airbus Leonardo partnership, agreed to sell 20 planes to Iran. Germany's Siemens signed contracts to upgrade Iran railways and re-equip 50 locomotives. So Italy, state rail firm FS signed $1.4 billion deal to build up a high-speed railway between Qom and Iraq. So I think we jumped too quickly into conclusion that business will somehow facilitate the other issues like human rights and regional stability, but human rights are still breached. Nothing is happening and nothing changes. The people from Iranian opposition just telling me about hanging people on the streets. I don't think there is any change on this. So today we see the EU is a hostage, as I said, of its own investment in Iran and is not able to have a word. So I would recommend to the EU leaders to pay attention to our future more than to current profits. Yep. We cannot accept people are killing everywhere.
Absolutely. And Paulo, we're down to the last 5 minutes of the programme, going very quickly this programme. Can you give us a little bit of an insight into what Iran is doing within Syria? Because in recent weeks we've seen that the Iranians have fired 20 rockets from Syria into Israel by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, and it looks like they are completing their sheer crescent from Iran to Iraq to Syria and also in Lebanon. Can you give us very briefly an insight into what's happening?
Well, I think that the majority of the forces that are on the ground in Syria for the side of the Assad's regime are Iranian-led. That is, it is a multinational force that has people coming from Pakistan, from Afghanistan, from Iraq, Lebanon. Lebanon is the most well-known contingent, and it is really an occupation, an Iranian occupation of the Syrian soil that comes within an expansionist agenda that has been going for decades and that has been really overlooked by the West. And this has to stop. This is one of the major issues, together with the issues like human rights and, of course, the nuclear issue that has to be dealt with together by the European authorities. But there, you know, the business with Iran, if we look at the statistics, Iran means roughly 0.5 to 0.6 of European trade. So it's not really enormous. What is really peculiar on the Iranian relationship with Europe? It's exactly the non-transparent character of these deals that we have been speaking about. And in this circumstance, when the deputy foreign minister of Iran tweets saying, if Europeans stop trading with Iran and don't put pressure on US, then we will reveal which Western politicians and how much money they had received during nuclear negotiations to make Iran deal happen. And this has been in a tweet, this has been publicized, then the European lawmakers have to give an explanation. And this is exactly why this morning I requested to Olaf to launch a criminal investigation on corruption by the European officials that are named here by the Deputy Foreign Minister of Iran. And I think this is the crux of the matter. And we cannot tolerate to have leaders that are really accepting to be bribed by Iran because they are betraying Europe and they are betraying our values.
Absolutely, and you heard it here first on the European report. Tomas, would you want to respond to that? The idea that the Iranians are bribing European leaders to continue with the Iran deal?
No, I'm very proud to work together with Paulo and count him as a dear friend because of this amazing work that you've done and to bring our leaders to account. I think this is absolutely important. What I would like to say just in closing is that this is a time, if we ever need to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, where we need to also pray for the Palestinians who are being kept hostage by their own people who use them as human shields. And I think what we are responsible for as Europeans is to allow this to continue, and not only allow it to continue, but to fund Palestinian school books which are encouraging the children to give up their lives for this cause of jihadism. We are not as innocent in Europe as we would like to be, and maybe this is also another crux that makes the Europeans side with Hamas, or at least put them on even on the same level as Israel when they try to look at the conflict. So we should definitely do everything we can to support the Palestinian people, but that doesn't mean that we have to be against Israel. It's to make our leaders accountable as to how they relate to the leaders of the Palestinian people.
And just very briefly, Branislav, how can our viewers stand with brave and courageous members of the European Parliament like yourself, so that you get the support that you deserve to have that moral clarity to speak truth to power here in the European Parliament?
Yeah, so if they are believers, so I ask them to pray, because this is war of thoughts, and we have to be of clear mind and to express our mind. Second, people need to be vocal about their opinion and do not hesitate to engage in the public discussion with their friends and on social media, on public debates. And third, I would say follow the political activities of politicians. Speak to them. People holding an office can easily get disconnected from the interests of his or her citizens, so we need to make sure they hear us.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for being my guest on this edition of the European Report.
Thank you, Simon.
And I just want to thank you for watching today's European Report here from the European Parliament in the heart of the European Union, as we discuss the Iran deal, as we discuss the growing and deteriorating situation in the Middle East. And as Tomas said, now is the time to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. So thank you for watching this month's programme.